Hello, and welcome back to Religious Stories for Sleep. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will make you profoundly grateful for your current existence. A world where you can wear mismatched socks, skip your uncle's birthday dinner with a quick text, and eat lunch without consulting a 2,000-year-old manual on proper chewing etiquette. We're traveling to ancient and imperial China, to a world governed not by laws alone, but by ritual propriety so comprehensive, so all-consuming, that it regulated everything from how you walked, to how you breathed in the presence of your elders, to the precise angle at which you should bow when encountering your cousin's husband's grandfather. Yes, that's specific. This is the world shaped by Confucius and his disciples, a world where philosophy wasn't something you pondered over coffee, but something that dictated whether you could have coffee at all, and if so, who should pour it, in what order, and with what exact hand gesture. Spoiler alert, you would get it wrong. Tonight's journey will unfold in 4 gentle segments. First, we'll immerse you in a single day attempting to navigate Confucian ritual, and watch you fail spectacularly at breakfast. Then, we'll trace the life of Confucius himself, a man who dedicated his existence to teaching others how to sit properly. Third, we'll explore the deep mystery of ancestral rituals, those elaborate ceremonies that connected the living to the dead through carefully arranged fruit and a staggering amount of bowing. Finally, we'll peek into the lives of the scholar officials, the elite who actually managed to master all this, or at least convincingly pretended to. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to appreciate every unregulated moment of your modern, blessedly informal life. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys into history's more exhausting corners, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment about which ancient civilization you'd least like to navigate, and giving this video a like. Your engagement helps us continue crafting these nocturnal historical escapes. Now, let the ritual begin. Imagine yourself waking in a household in Han Dynasty China, around the 1st century CE. The Confucian system has been the state ideology for a century already, and its tendrils have wound themselves around every aspect of daily existence. You open your eyes, and already you're in trouble. You've woken before your father. This is good. You'll need the time to prepare. But you've slept on your left side, and according to some interpretations of ritual propriety, this demonstrates a casual attitude toward the ancestral spirits who should occupy your thoughts even in slumber. The right side, you see, orients your heart toward the heavens. Congratulations on your first mistake, achieved while unconscious. You sit up. How you sit up matters. There's a correct way to rise from a sleeping mat, and it involves a particular sequence of movements that demonstrates self-control and mindfulness. You cannot simply lurch upright like some kind of barbarian. The body must unfold with deliberate grace, back first, then drawing the legs in, then rising in a single fluid motion that would make a yoga instructor weep with envy. You, of course, just roll over and stand up like any normal human being. Strike 2. Now you must dress, and here is where things become truly Byzantine. Your clothing is not merely fabric to prevent nakedness. It is a complex signaling system that broadcasts your status, your age, your role in the family hierarchy, and your level of respect for propriety itself. The layers must be donned in a specific order. The inner garment first, white, symbolizing purity of intent. Then the middle robe, its color determined by your social position and the season. Finally, the outer robe, which must be arranged so that the left side overlaps the right, because the reverse would mark you as a northern barbarian, and we wouldn't want that confusion at breakfast. The belt is its own ordeal. Its width, material, and the ornaments attached to it all carry meaning. Jade for scholars, leather for laborers, silk for officials. The sword or ornamental dagger, yes, even scholars wore them, more for ritual than combat, must hang at precisely the correct angle. Too far forward and you appear martially aggressive. Too far back and you seem slovenly, as if you can't even manage a decorative weapon properly. And your hair. Oh, your hair. In Confucian society, hair is a gift from your parents, and to cut it unnecessarily is an act of unfilial impiety. This means you haven't had a real haircut since you were a child, and your hair is now long enough to sit on. It must be wound up into a top knot, secured with pins, and covered with a cap appropriate to your status. The cap itself is an elaborate indicator of your education level, social rank, and ceremonial role. Putting on a hat has become a 15-minute operation, requiring a bronze mirror and the concentration of a neurosurgeon. You are now dressed. It has taken 40 minutes. You haven't eaten yet. You step out of your sleeping chamber into the main courtyard of the family compound. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the kitchen compound and the faint sweetness of the apricot tree near the ancestor hall. Birds call from the tiled roofs. It would be peaceful if you weren't immediately confronted with the need to greet every single person you encounter with exactly the correct gesture for their position relative to yours in the intricate family hierarchy. Here comes your eldest brother. He is 10 years your senior, which means he occupies a position of authority over you despite you both being adults. You must bow, but how deeply? He is your brother, not your father. So a full prostration would be absurd and might even insult him by suggesting he's pretending to parental authority. But a mere nod would be shockingly disrespectful. The correct gesture is a bow from the waist, approximately 45 degrees, with your hands clasped before you, right hand over left, because the reverse is, again, the barbarian style. You must hold this position until he acknowledges you with a nod, and then you may rise, but not too quickly, because that would suggest impatience with the ritual itself. You, of course, just bob your head and say, "Good morning," like a civilized person from any other era. Your brother looks at you as if you've just spoken in tongues. Now your younger sister approaches, and this is somehow more complicated. She is younger, so she should defer to you, but she is also married to the son of a minor official, which elevates her social status, even though she's still your junior in the family hierarchy. The correct greeting requires calibrating respect for her age position against acknowledgement of her husband's status. You're supposed to offer a slight bow, perhaps 30 degrees, while she offers a deeper one. But you must time it so that you initiate first, demonstrating that you recognize the situation's complexity and are being generous in your acknowledgement of her married status. You have a headache already, and the sun has been up for 20 minutes. The family now gathers in the courtyard for morning ancestor veneration. This is not optional. Every single morning, before anyone eats, before the day's work begins, the family assembles before the ancestral shrine, a special chamber or alcove where wooden tablets bearing the names of deceased family members are arranged in careful hierarchical order. Your father, as the family patriarch, leads the ceremony. He approaches the shrine with slow, measured steps. Each step is the same length. You're supposed to glide rather than walk, maintaining perfect posture as if balanced on your head is an invisible stack of books, He lights incense, 3 sticks, never 2 or 4. 2 is for funerals of the recently deceased. 4 is inauspicious, sounding like the word for death. 3 is for general veneration. The smoke rises in delicate threads, carrying prayers and respect to the ancestors who, according to Confucian belief, continue to watch over the family and influence its fortune. Your father bows, a deep, formal bow, nearly a full prostration. The rest of the family follows in order of seniority. Your grandfather, if he were still alive, would go first, but he passed 2 years ago and is now one of the tablets. Your uncle, your father's younger brother, bows, then your eldest brother, then you, then your younger siblings, then your mother and the other women of the household, though they may perform their bows from a slightly different position depending on the era and the family's interpretation of the rites. Each bow must be held for the correct duration, long enough to demonstrate sincerity, but not so long that it appears performative, or suggests you're showing off your piety. You must think appropriate thoughts during the bow. You're supposed to be mentally reporting your plans for the day to the ancestors, asking for their guidance, and reflecting on whether your actions honor their memory. You're actually thinking about breakfast and wondering if there will be millet porridge. The morning veneration takes 20 minutes. Your knees hurt. You have bowed 6 times now, deeply, and the day has barely begun. Finally, breakfast. Surely, here you can relax. Just eat some food like a normal human being. Perhaps have a conversation. Absolutely not. The family proceeds to the dining hall, but you cannot simply sit down. There is a seating arrangement determined by age, gender, and family role. Your father sits in the position of honor, facing south, south being the direction of the emperor, the sun, yang energy, all things auspicious. Your mother sits to his left, your uncle to his right. You and your siblings arrange yourselves in descending order of age. The youngest children sit furthest from the patriarch. Your pregnant sister-in-law sits in a particular position that acknowledges both her status as a daughter-in-law and her honored role as a woman carrying the next generation. No one sits before your father sits. When he finally lowers himself to the mat at the low table, there is a choreographed sequence in which everyone else sits in order, eldest to youngest. If you sit before your turn, you have committed a visible breach of filial piety that will be remembered at family gatherings for years. The food arrives, brought by servants or younger family members. The dishes are arranged in a specific pattern on the table. Rice, being the staple and most sacred food, occupies the central position. Side dishes of vegetables, pickles, and perhaps a small amount of meat radiate outward in a pattern that reflects cosmological harmony. The teapot is positioned just so. You cannot eat before your father begins eating. Everyone sits, hands in laps or folded on the table, never reaching for food, until the patriarch picks up his chopsticks. Even then, there is an order. He takes the first portion of rice, makes the first selection from the shared dishes, then your uncle, then your eldest brother, then you, finally, may reach for food. But how you use your chopsticks is itself a minefield of symbolic meaning. You must never point them at someone, which is aggressive. You must never stand them upright in your rice, which is how rice is offered to the dead, and suggests you're wishing death on everyone at the table. You must never wave them around while talking, which is uncouth. You must never use them to spear food, which suggests you don't even understand what chopsticks are for. You should lift food delicately, with minimal noise, and place it in your bowl before conveying it to your mouth. And speaking of your mouth, chew with it closed. No smacking, No slurping unless it's soup, in which case gentle slurping is acceptable, as it demonstrates you're appreciating the temperature and flavor. But not loud slurping. There's a decibel range for appropriate soup appreciation. Conversation during the meal is permitted, but regulated. You may not speak of disturbing topics: death, disease, business failures, political intrigue. The meal should be a harmonious time, and harmony is maintained through pleasant, inconsequential discussion of nature, poetry, or the proper interpretation of the classics. Your father might quiz you on a passage from the Analects or the Book of Rites. You are expected to respond with both accuracy and appropriate humility, demonstrating your learning without appearing proud of it. If you need to cough, you must turn away from the table, cover your mouth with your sleeve, and do so as quietly as possible. If you need to leave the table before the meal is finished, say for a bathroom emergency, you must first request permission from your father, explain the necessity in the most oblique and euphemistic terms possible, and exit walking backward so you don't turn your back on the patriarch. You finish eating when everyone else finishes, which is to say, when your father decides the meal is over. He will set down his chopsticks, perhaps make a small comment about the quality of the food, and then rise. Everyone else may then set down their chopsticks and rise, again in order of seniority. Breakfast has taken 45 minutes and required the concentration of a chess master. The morning's work begins. What you do depends on your social position. If you are a scholar, and let's assume you are, because laborers have their own hierarchy but slightly less elaborate ritual requirements in daily life, your morning is devoted to study. You return to your chamber, or perhaps to a shared study room with your brothers, and you sit at a low desk to read and practice calligraphy. But even sitting is regulated. There is a correct scholarly posture: back straight, shoulders relaxed, head tilted slightly forward as if listening to the wisdom of the sages through the characters on the page. Your legs should be folded beneath you or crossed in a position that can be maintained for hours. Slouching is not merely lazy. It is a visible demonstration that you lack the self-discipline necessary for true learning. You are reading the classics, perhaps the Analects of Confucius, or the Mencius, or the Book of Rites itself, which is ironic because you are reading descriptions of the very rituals you are required to perform, creating a kind of feedback loop of propriety. The calligraphy practice is equally important. Your handwriting reveals your character. Sloppy brushwork suggests a sloppy mind. Characters that are too rigid suggest you lack creativity. Characters that are too flowing suggest you're undisciplined. You're aiming for a perfect balance of structure and fluidity that will take decades to achieve. Your teacher, if you have one, or your father if you don't, may arrive to discuss your reading. When he enters the room, you must immediately stand and bow, even if you were in the middle of a brushstroke. You remain standing until he invites you to sit. The lesson proceeds as a dialogue, but it's not an equal exchange. You may ask questions, but they must be phrased with appropriate deference. I am ignorant and confused by this passage. Might the teacher illuminate my clouded understanding? Not, what does this mean? If your teacher corrects you, you accept the correction with a bow and a verbal acknowledgement of your error. You do not argue, even if you believe you're right. Arguing with the teacher is a breach of the student-teacher relationship, which is modeled on the father-son relationship, which is the fundamental building block of social order. To argue is to threaten civilization itself. No pressure. The study session lasts 2 hours. Then there is a brief break, during which you may walk in the garden to clear your mind. But even walking has correct and incorrect forms. You should move with measured steps, hands clasped behind your back or held loosely at your sides, eyes observing the natural world with a contemplative gaze. You should not run, skip, or move in any way that suggests childish enthusiasm. You are a scholar, possibly in your 20s, and you must walk like you're already an elderly sage. Midday brings the next meal, which follows all the same rules as breakfast, but with the added complexity of possibly having guests. If a friend or distant relative arrives, and dropping by unannounced is socially acceptable in a way that would horrify modern people, the seating arrangements must be recalculated on the spot to accommodate the guest's social rank relative to everyone present. Let's say your father's friend, a retired official, arrives just as the meal is being set out. Your father must greet him with the correct level of ceremony. Bows are exchanged. Ritualized inquiries about health and family are made. Is your honored mother well? She continues in good health, thanks to your kind concern. And then the guest must be offered the appropriate seat. He cannot sit in your father's position. That would be insulting, suggesting he's trying to usurp your father's role. But he must be seated in a position that honors his status, probably to your father's right, which means your uncle must move down a position, which means you and your siblings all shift, and the entire spatial arrangement of the meal has been reorganized like a game of musical mats. The meal proceeds with even more careful attention to propriety than breakfast, because there is a guest to impress. The conversation is elevated, probably discussion of poetry, recent scholarly interpretations of classical texts, or carefully neutral political observations. You are expected to participate enough to demonstrate your education, but not so much that you appear to be showing off or competing with your elders. This is a nearly impossible balance. The guest, out of politeness, will at some point compliment the food. Your father, out of politeness, must demur and apologize for the humble quality of the meal, even if it's actually quite elaborate. The guest will insist it's wonderful. Your father will insist it's barely adequate. This exchange will loop several times before both men tacitly agree to move on, honor satisfied on both sides. After the midday meal, there is rest time, a brief period when studying is considered less auspicious due to the heat and the body's natural post-meal lethargy. You might nap, but even napping has a proper form, lying on your right side, head oriented correctly, in a position that suggests rest rather than slovenly collapse. The afternoon brings more study, possibly some physical education if you're young enough. Physical training for scholars is not about becoming a warrior, that's a different social class, but about maintaining health and demonstrating discipline. You might practice archery, not to hunt or fight, but because archery is one of the 6 arts of Confucianism. The bow must be drawn with correct posture, the release must be smooth, and the entire process should reflect inner harmony. Whether you hit the target is almost secondary to whether you look correct while trying. Or you might practice calligraphy some more. There is always more calligraphy. As evening approaches, there is another ancestor veneration, shorter than the morning one, more of a check-in with the ancestral spirits to report on the day's activities and demonstrate continued respect. The evening meal is similar to the previous meals, with all the same rules, though perhaps slightly more relaxed since the day is winding down and there are fewer guests. Afterward, there might be time for leisure, reading poetry, playing the kin, a stringed instrument that scholars were expected to master, or engaging in refined conversation with family members. But even leisure is structured. You cannot simply lounge around reading whatever you want. There are appropriate texts for evening reading, poetry, philosophical works, historical records. You should not read military strategy at night. It's too yang, too aggressive for the yin time of day. You should not read comedic or frivolous works. They don't cultivate the serious moral character expected of a scholar. If you play the chin, you must play it in the correct emotional state. The chin is not entertainment. It's a meditative practice, a way of cultivating inner harmony and expressing refined emotion. You should play sitting in the correct posture, in a quiet room, preferably with incense burning. The goal is not to impress anyone, but to align yourself with the natural order through music. If you play it like a performance, you've missed the point. As night falls, you prepare for sleep. There is a ritual for this too. Washing with water that has been heated to the correct temperature, changing into sleeping garments, different from day clothes, and the change must be done in private with appropriate modesty, and arranging your sleeping mat in the correct orientation. Before you sleep, you might engage in a brief meditation or reflection on the day. Did you honor your parents? Did you treat your siblings with appropriate respect? Did you study diligently? Did you maintain proper posture, speech, and conduct at all times? You're supposed to mentally review your behavior, identify shortcomings, and resolve to do better tomorrow. This is also exhausting. You lie down, on your right side, remember, and close your eyes. You have survived one day under Confucian ritual order. You have bowed approximately 30 times. You have regulated your posture, your speech, your eating, your walking, your sitting, your studying, your resting, and your thinking. You have been constantly aware of your position in multiple overlapping hierarchies, age, gender, family role, social status, and have adjusted your behavior accordingly in every single interaction. And tomorrow, you will do it all again, and the day after that, and every day for your entire life, unless you renounce society and become a hermit, which is itself a recognized and ritualized role with its own set of expectations. The Confucian order is not a set of occasional ceremonial requirements. It is a total way of life, a comprehensive system that governs every waking moment and even encroaches on sleep. It is designed to create social harmony, to maintain hierarchical order, to cultivate virtue through constant practice, and to connect each individual to a cosmic order that stretches from the humblest daily action to the movements of the heavens. It is also completely impossible for anyone not raised from birth in this system, and even then, people spent their entire lives trying to master it, and still made mistakes. The beauty of it, the terrifying and awe-inspiring beauty, is that this isn't mythology or religious fantasy. This is history. Real people lived this way for centuries. They woke up and bowed, ate with ritualized precision, studied texts that taught them how to bow and eat, and passed this system down to their children, who taught it to their children, creating a cultural continuity that shaped one of the world's great civilizations. And now you can roll over, scratch wherever you want, and go back to sleep without worrying whether the angle of your scratching respects the ancestral spirits. You're welcome. Now that you've experienced the exhausting reality of living under the Confucian system, you might be wondering, who exactly thought this was a good idea? Who looked at human existence and decided, you know what this needs? More bowing. Let us turn our attention to the man himself, Confucian, known to the West as Confucius, a man who spent his entire life trying to convince people that what society really needed was a comprehensive manual on sitting properly, and who somehow succeeded in making this vision outlive empires. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province, during a period that historians politely call the Spring and Autumn period. This name evokes gentle seasonal transitions and poetic contemplation. The reality was closer to the period when everyone was constantly invading everyone else, and philosophical systems emerged, partly as coping mechanisms for living in chaos. China, at this time, was theoretically unified under the Zhou dynasty, but the Zhou king had become essentially a ceremonial figurehead. Real power belonged to various regional lords who spent their time fighting each other, forming alliances, breaking alliances, and generally ensuring that anyone with sense stayed indoors as much as possible. It was a world of collapsing authority, where the old certainties were crumbling and new ideas competed for attention in a marketplace of philosophies. Into this world of uncertainty came a boy whose family was minor nobility, aristocratic enough to have pretensions, not wealthy enough to do much about them. Confucius's father, Kong He, was a military officer of some distinction, reportedly a man of great physical strength who had performed heroic deeds in battle. He was also quite old when Confucius was born, having married the boy's mother, Yan Zhengzai, when he was in his 60s and she was a teenager. This was not uncommon for the time, though it does make for an awkward family dynamic by any era's standards. Kong. He died when Confucius was 3 years old, leaving the family in reduced circumstances. Confucius's mother raised him in relative poverty, which meant he experienced firsthand the anxiety of being educated enough to know what status his family had lost, but not wealthy enough to easily reclaim it. This liminal position, too cultured to be a commoner, too poor to be comfortably elite, would shape his entire worldview. He was always an outsider, with his face pressed against the window of power, trying to convince people to let him in so he could rearrange their furniture according to ancient principles. As a young man, Confucius was apparently quite tall. The sources mention this repeatedly, which suggests it was noteworthy. He held various minor positions: granary manager, livestock supervisor. These were not glamorous jobs. Imagine someone who would later be revered as one of history's greatest sages, spending his 20s counting sacks of grain and making sure the cows didn't wander off. He reportedly performed these duties with meticulous attention to detail, because of course he did. If there was a correct way to stack grain that reflected cosmic harmony, Confucius would find it. But his real passion was studying the classics, the ancient texts, poetry, and historical records of the early Zhou dynasty, a period he idealized as a golden age when rulers were wise, ministers were loyal, and everyone knew exactly how to behave at formal dinners. Whether this golden age ever actually existed is debatable. Confucius certainly believed it did, and he devoted himself to recovering and systematizing the wisdom of the ancients. He began teaching in his 30s. This was itself somewhat radical. Previously, education had been reserved for aristocrats and conducted within elite families or courts. Confucius accepted students based on their desire to learn rather than their social status, though he did require payment. The payment didn't have to be money. The famous story tells of a student who paid with dried meat, which was apparently the ancient Chinese equivalent of showing up to class with an apple for the teacher. Except the meat wouldn't go bad as quickly in an era before refrigeration, so it was actually more practical. His teaching method was dialogue, question and answer, discussion, and debate. Though within the proper hierarchical framework where the teacher's authority was always acknowledged. He didn't lecture from a prepared text. He responded to students' questions, illustrated points with historical examples, and occasionally made cryptic observations that his disciples would spend years trying to interpret. The Analects, the primary source for Confucius's teachings, is essentially a collection of these exchanges, compiled by his students after his death. Reading it is like overhearing one side of a phone conversation. You get Confucius's responses and have to infer what the questions were. The master said, "At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I knew the will of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing what was right." This is either profound wisdom about the stages of moral development or the ancient equivalent of a motivational Instagram post. Possibly both. What's notable about Confucius's teaching is that he wasn't particularly interested in metaphysics, theology, or the supernatural. When students asked about spirits or the afterlife, he famously responded, "You do not yet know about the living. How can you know about the dead?" His focus was relentlessly practical. How to be a good person, how to create a harmonious society, how to govern justly. And his answer to all these questions was essentially, study the past, practice ritual, cultivate virtue, and for heaven's sake, maintain proper relationships. The concept of ritual propriety, was central to his vision. He believed that by performing the correct rituals, people would internalize the values those rituals represented. Bowing to your parents wasn't just an empty gesture. It was a physical practice that cultivated genuine respect and filial piety. Do it often enough, with sincerity, and eventually your inner character would align with your outer behavior. Fake it till you make it, but make it a 3,000-year-old version endorsed by ancient kings. By his 40s, Confucius had attracted a substantial following of students. Some of them were quite devoted, traveling with him, recording his words, and essentially forming a philosophical entourage. This gave him enough credibility to seek political office, because what he really wanted wasn't just to teach. He wanted to implement his ideas at the state level. He wanted to be the advisor to a ruler who would embrace his vision of governance through virtue and ritual. This did not go well. Confucius spent years traveling between states, offering his services to various rulers. The pitch was essentially, "Hire me, and I will help you govern according to ancient principles of ritual and virtue, which will create such harmony that your state will naturally become powerful and prosperous." The rulers, who were more interested in immediate military and economic strategies, generally responded with polite variations of, "That's fascinating. Thank you for stopping by." In the state of Lu, Confucius did briefly hold a significant position, minister of crime, or perhaps a senior judicial role. The exact title is debated. He apparently did well enough that a neighboring state became concerned about Lu's increasing stability and sent a gift of dancing girls and horses to distract the ruler. The ruler accepted the gift and became, indeed, distracted, neglecting his duties. Confucius, disgusted by this lapse in ritual propriety and governance, resigned and left the state. This began a period of wandering that lasted about 13 years. Confucius traveled from state to state, accompanied by his closest disciples, looking for a ruler who would employ him. It must have been a strange sight. This tall, middle-aged man and his group of devoted followers, arriving at various courts with their message of ritualized governance. Picture the scene. Confucius and his disciples approach the court of a regional lord. They are announced. The lord receives them with the appropriate ceremony, because even if he's not going to hire Confucius, rejecting him without proper ritual would be gauche. Confucius bows. The disciples bow. Everyone performs the expected formalities. Then Confucius begins his pitch. If your lordship would but embrace the virtues of the ancient sage kings, practice sincerity in ritual, and govern through moral example rather than force. And the Lord, who has 3 armies to maintain, 2 hostile neighbors, and a court full of competing factions, thinks, this is lovely in theory, but how does it help me not get invaded next month? Sometimes the rejections were polite. Sometimes they were less so. Once, Confucius and his group ran out of food while traveling and faced starvation. They were trapped between states, effectively refugees, surviving on whatever they could forage. His disciples asked him, essentially, "Are you sure this is working? This plan of wandering around promoting ritual propriety?" "Because we're starving," Confucius reportedly responded with something about how the noble person remains committed to the way, even in adversity, which is philosophically admirable, but doesn't actually fill stomachs. Another time, he was mistaken for someone else, a person who had apparently caused trouble in that region and was briefly detained. His disciples were worried. Confucius was calm, saying that heaven had entrusted him with preserving culture and wisdom, so obviously he would be fine. He was released, but the incident illustrates how precarious his position often was. He was an itinerant teacher with grand ideas but no real power, dependent on the goodwill of rulers who might or might not care about ancient ritual. What sustained him was absolute conviction in the rightness of his cause. He believed deeply that he was preserving something essential, the cultural and moral heritage of civilization itself. The Zhou dynasty's early days represented, to him, a time when society had been properly ordered, when rulers had been virtuous, when ritual had created harmony. That this golden age might have been partly mythical didn't matter. The ideal was real to him, and worth dedicating his life to recovering. In his 60s, Confucius gave up the search for political employment and returned to Lu. He spent his remaining years teaching, editing classical texts, and reportedly working on the Spring and Autumn Annals, a historical chronicle of his home state. He had failed, by his own standards. He had not found a ruler willing to implement his vision of ritual governance, but he had succeeded in creating something perhaps more enduring, a school of thought and a group of dedicated students who would carry his ideas forward. His personal life, like his political career, was marked by loss and disappointment. His son died before him. His favorite disciple Yan Hui also died young. Confucius mourned these deaths with a grief that seems to have genuinely overwhelmed his usual composure. When Yan Hui died, he reportedly cried out, "Heaven has bereft me! Heaven has bereft me!" His other disciples were somewhat alarmed by this display of emotion from a man who taught self-control. Confucius died in 479 BCE, at the age of 72. He died believing he had failed in his life's mission. He had not restored the Zhou order. He had not found a ruler to employ his methods. He was a teacher who had attracted devoted students, but had never wielded the political power he sought. He could not have known that within a few centuries his ideas would become the foundation of Chinese imperial governance, that his name would be invoked by emperors, that temples would be built in his honor, that students would spend years memorizing his words, that the ritual system he championed would shape Chinese society for over 2 millennia. He died thinking he was a failure. This is either tragic or hilarious, depending on your perspective. The man who spent his life trying to get a government job became, after his death, the government job's theoretical foundation. Every imperial official, every scholar bureaucrat, every educated person in China for the next 2,000 years would study his teachings. His failure became history's most successful failure. But who was he, really, as a person beneath the philosophy? The Analects gives us glimpses. He had a sense of humor, dry, subtle, but definitely present. When a disciple asked if there was one word that could guide conduct throughout life, Confucius responded, "Shu, reciprocity. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself." This is the negative formulation of the Golden Rule, and it's presented not as grand revelation but as practical advice. One word, reciprocity. There you go. He was not ascetic. He enjoyed music, appreciated good food, and thought wine was fine in moderation. He didn't believe virtue required suffering or deprivation, just discipline and proper conduct. He reportedly would not eat his rice if it wasn't properly prepared, and would not sit if his mat wasn't straight. This could be seen as fussy and pedantic, or as a man who believed that attention to small details was the foundation of larger moral order, probably both. He was apparently quite musical. He played the stone chimes and the chin and believed music was essential to moral education. Music, properly composed and performed, could harmonize the emotions and elevate the spirit. Bad music, by which he meant music that was chaotic or overly emotional, could corrupt character. He once heard a particular piece of music that moved him so deeply he didn't taste meat for 3 months afterward, which seems extreme, but suggests genuine aesthetic sensitivity. He was also, let's be honest, somewhat obsessive. His commitment to ritual could border on the compulsive. The Analects records his habits. He would not eat too much. He would not speak while eating. He would not sleep like a corpse, meaning sprawled out, presumably. His disciples recorded these details because they saw them as exemplary. But reading them now, one can't help but think, this man really could not relax. And yet, his disciples loved him. They followed him through poverty and danger. They compiled his sayings with reverence. They dedicated their lives to spreading his teachings. He must have possessed some personal quality beyond just his ideas, charisma, kindness, perhaps the conviction that comes from absolute certainty. Or maybe they were just impressed by how straight he could keep his sitting mat. One of the more humanizing stories involves Confucius encountering a recluse, one of the hermit philosophers who had rejected society entirely and lived in withdrawal. The hermit criticized Confucius for wasting his time trying to reform a world that was clearly beyond hope. Why not just withdraw, cultivate personal virtue, and leave the world to its chaos? Confucius's response, paraphrased, was essentially, "If I don't try, who will?" He acknowledged that success was unlikely, but argued that the moral imperative to try remained. To withdraw was to abandon duty. Even if the world couldn't be saved, the attempt had to be made. This is either admirable stubbornness or foolish pride, and Confucius embodied both. His daily routine in his later years was probably very much like the routine we described in segment 1, except he was the one who had designed it. He woke early, performed his ablutions with care, dressed according to proper ritual, greeted his family with appropriate ceremony, made offerings to ancestors, ate with deliberate propriety, taught his students, studied the classics, practiced music, took measured walks in his garden, and went to bed at the correct hour, having reviewed his conduct for the day. He did this every single day, year after year, finding in the repetition not tedium but meaning. The ritual wasn't burdensome to him. It was liberating, providing structure in a chaotic world, creating islands of order in a sea of disorder. Imagine living that way. Imagine waking up every morning and knowing exactly what to do, exactly how to do it, exactly what it means. No existential uncertainty, no ambiguity, no need to figure out your purpose, because your purpose is woven into every gesture, every word, every action. You are participating in a cosmic order that connects you to the past, to your family, to society, to heaven itself. For Confucius, this wasn't a burden. This was freedom. Of course, he was also the one who invented the system, which probably made it easier to follow. It's one thing to live by rules you've created. It's another to live by rules someone else created for you. His disciples chose to follow his teachings. Later, generations had them imposed through education and state ideology. That's a significant difference. But in Confucius himself, we see someone who genuinely believed that human flourishing came through cultivation, deliberate, continuous, ritualized cultivation of virtue. He wasn't interested in sudden enlightenment or mystical experiences. He was interested in incremental improvement through daily practice. Be slightly better today than yesterday. Bow a little more sincerely. Study a little more diligently. Speak a little more carefully. Do this for 70 years, and you might become a sage. Or you might just become very good at bowing. In his final days, Confucius reportedly knew his death was approaching. He told his disciples that his life's work was complete, not because he had succeeded in his political aims, but because he had transmitted the teachings of the ancients to a new generation. He had kept the flame alive. What happened next was up to them. He died in his bed, surrounded by disciples, probably in the correct sleeping position, having presumably spent his last conscious moments in appropriate ritual contemplation. His disciples mourned him for 3 years, following the mourning protocols for a father. Some of them built huts near his grave and stayed for 6 years. One disciple, Zigong, remained for 6 years total, building a hut and essentially living in the graveyard, which is either touching devotion or concerning obsession, depending on your perspective. But their mourning was not just personal grief. They were mourning the loss of what they believed was their one chance to see their teacher's vision implemented. With Confucius gone, who would convince the rulers? Who had his authority, his knowledge, his commitment? They didn't yet know that his real success wouldn't come in his lifetime, but in theirs, and their students, and their students' students, as his ideas spread slowly through Chinese society, like water seeping into every crack and crevice of a stone foundation. Confucius spent his life trying to make people bow correctly, and in the end, a civilization did. Not because he forced them, not because he conquered them, but because his ideas, written down and transmitted, preserved and studied, eventually became so embedded in Chinese culture that they felt like common sense. Ritual propriety, filial piety, hierarchical harmony, these became the water in which Chinese society swam, so pervasive that they became invisible. That's a strange kind of victory, one that took centuries to achieve, and that the victor never witnessed. But perhaps Confucius would have appreciated the irony. He was, after all, a man who believed that the proper way to honor the past was to make it live in the present through daily practice. He taught that the ancient sages achieved immortality, not through temples or statues, but through the continuation of their principles in the lives of others. By that standard, he achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. He just had to die first to get there. As you rest here, breathing slowly, letting the story settle into your mind, consider this. Confucius spent 72 years trying to convince people to care more about how they sat down. And he won. Not in his lifetime, but eventually, thoroughly, completely, which suggests either that history has a sense of humor, or that sometimes the most absurd ideas are also the most powerful, or both, probably both. We've navigated the exhausting daily rituals of Confucian life, and we've traced the biography of the man who systematized this beautiful madness. Now we arrive at perhaps the strangest, most haunting aspect of the entire system, the veneration of ancestors. Why did the Chinese spend thousands of years talking to dead people through carefully arranged fruit? This is not a rhetorical question with an easy answer. Ancestor veneration was not simply a quaint tradition or a holdover from primitive superstition. It was the beating heart of Chinese religious and social life, the foundation upon which family, society, and eventually the state itself were constructed. And unlike many religious practices that can be explained through theology or mythology, ancestor veneration operates in a curious gray zone between religion, philosophy, psychology, and practical social organization. It is both utterly foreign to modern Western sensibilities and strangely, disturbingly relatable once you understand what it was actually trying to accomplish. Let us descend into this mystery. The practice of ancestor veneration in China predates Confucius by centuries, possibly millennia. Archaeological evidence from the Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE, shows elaborate burial practices, oracle bone inscriptions requesting guidance from deceased kings, and ritual vessels specifically designed for offerings to the dead. This wasn't just burying people with nice things. This was systematic communication with the departed, treated as a regular administrative function of the state. The Shang kings consulted their ancestors on everything: military campaigns, agricultural decisions, the health of the royal family, the interpretation of omens. Oracle bones, usually turtle shells or ox scapulae, were inscribed with questions, then heated until they cracked. The pattern of cracks was interpreted as the ancestors' response. It was a divine hotline, with the ancestors serving as intermediaries between the human world and the higher powers. When the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang around 1046 BCE, they inherited this practice but modified it. The Zhou introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers governed with divine approval, but that this approval could be withdrawn if the ruler became corrupt or incompetent. This was a remarkably sophisticated political theology, essentially arguing that rebellion against a bad ruler was not only acceptable, but cosmically endorsed. The ancestors fit into this system as both witnesses and participants. They observed the living, judged their conduct, and could intervene, positively or negatively, in worldly affairs. A family that honored its ancestors properly could expect blessings, good harvests, healthy children, success in examinations, prosperity in business. A family that neglected its ancestors could expect misfortune, illness, crop failure, official disgrace, the kind of cascading bad luck that suggested cosmic disapproval. But, and this is crucial, the ancestors were not gods. They were dead relatives. They had once been human, with all the flaws and limitations that implied. They had favorite foods, personality quirks, unresolved grievances. They could be petty, demanding, or difficult, just as they had been in life. This made them simultaneously more accessible and more complicated than distant deities. You weren't praying to an abstract divine principle. You were reporting to Grandfather, who knew perfectly well that you'd been lazy about your studies and would not be impressed by your excuses. Confucius, when he encountered this existing tradition of ancestor veneration, did something characteristically clever. He systematized it, moralized it, and removed most of the supernatural uncertainty while keeping all the social control. He was remarkably evasive about whether the ancestors were actually listening. When asked about spirits and the afterlife, he deflected. What mattered to Confucius wasn't whether the ancestors' spirits literally inhabited their tablets or literally consumed the offerings. What mattered was the act of veneration itself, the ritual practice that cultivated filial piety, maintained family cohesion, and created a sense of continuity across generations. Perform the ritual as if the ancestors were present. Offer the food as if they would eat it. Bow as if they were watching. The sincerity of your performance was what mattered, not the metaphysical reality of their existence. This is both philosophically sophisticated and deeply frustrating. He essentially said, "I'm not going to tell you if ghosts are real, but act like they are, and make sure you do it correctly." The practical effect was to create a system where everyone went through the motions of ancestor veneration, but with wildly different underlying beliefs about what was actually happening. Some people genuinely believed their ancestors' spirits were present, watching, and capable of intervention. Others saw it as symbolic, a way of honoring memory and maintaining tradition. Still others probably thought it was superstitious nonsense, but went along because social pressure made it impossible not to. And all of them performed the same rituals, in the same way, creating a unified practice, despite diverse beliefs. The rituals themselves were elaborate, varied by occasion and family status, but followed general patterns that would be recognizable across centuries and regions. The ancestral shrine or altar was the physical focus. In wealthy households, this might be a dedicated room or building, elaborately decorated, with multiple tablets for several generations of ancestors. In poorer households, it might be a simple shelf with a single tablet, representing the immediate deceased. But every household, no matter how humble, was expected to maintain some form of ancestral altar. The tablets themselves were wooden plaques inscribed with the name and title of the deceased. These were not representations of the person, not portraits or statues, but something more abstract, a focal point for the ancestors' presence, a placeholder for their continuing existence in the family structure. The tablet was treated with the same respect as the living person would have received. It occupied a position in the household hierarchy. It was bowed to, spoken to, included in family decisions. If you moved the tablet, you moved it carefully, with appropriate ceremony. If the tablet was damaged, it was a crisis requiring specific rituals to apologize and make amends. The tablet was your grandfather, in a sense, or at least the most important remaining piece of him. Daily offerings were usually simple: incense, tea, perhaps a small amount of rice or fruit. These were placed before the tablets each morning, accompanied by bows and brief prayers or reports. Honored ancestors, your unworthy descendant greets you this morning and reports that the family continues in health. I am studying diligently and striving to bring honor to your name. that sort of thing. The offerings were left for a respectful period, long enough for the ancestors' spiritual essence to consume the spiritual essence of the food, which is a wonderfully untestable proposition, and then removed. The physical food was usually eaten by the family, because wasting food would itself be disrespectful and impractical. The ancestors had consumed what they needed. The living could have the rest. On special occasions, festivals, death anniversaries, important family events, the rituals became more elaborate. Tables would be laden with multiple dishes, carefully prepared according to the deceased's preferences or according to ritual prescription. Wine would be poured into special vessels. Multiple rounds of bowing would be performed, sometimes by the entire extended family in order of seniority. The Qingming festival, still celebrated today, was a major ancestral veneration occasion. Families would visit the graves of their ancestors, clean the burial sites, make offerings of food and paper money, to be burned, sending it to the spirit world, and spend time at the gravesite in contemplation and family gathering. It was part memorial service, part family reunion, part picnic, a strange blend of solemnity and social festivity. Death anniversaries were observed with particular care. The anniversary of a parent's death was a day of mourning and ritual for the filial child, regardless of how many years had passed. You would fast or eat only simple food, wear somber clothing, spend time at the ancestral altar in contemplation, and generally behave as if the grief were fresh. This could continue for decades after the death. Your father died 30 years ago. On his death anniversary, you still observe mourning protocols. This might seem excessive, but it served a function. It prevented the dead from being forgotten. It ensured that the memory of ancestors was actively maintained, not just passively recalled. They remained part of the family in a functional, ongoing way. The mourning period immediately following a death was even more elaborate, especially for parents. The classical mourning period for a father was 3 years, though in practice, this was usually calculated as approximately 25 to 27 months, depending on the interpretation. During this period, the filial child was expected to exhibit profound grief. You would wear coarse mourning clothes, usually undyed hemp or rough cotton. You would sleep on a mat on the floor or on hard boards, not in your normal bed. You would abstain from meat, alcohol, sexual relations, and entertainment. You would not attend celebrations or hold office. Your entire life was suspended in a state of ritualized grief. This was not optional. A scholar official who did not observe proper mourning for a parent could lose their position and be permanently disgraced. There are historical records of officials who, upon receiving news of a parent's death, immediately resigned their posts and rushed home to begin the mourning period, even if they were in the middle of critical government business. The idea was that grief was not just a private emotion, but a public duty, and that proper filial piety required demonstrating that grief through sustained ritual performance. You couldn't just be sad. You had to be sad in the correct way, for the correct duration, following the correct protocols. And here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Did this system actually create genuine grief, or just the performance of grief? The answer, almost certainly, is both. Start performing grief rituals, wearing uncomfortable clothes, sleeping on a hard floor, abstaining from pleasure, spending hours at the ancestral altar, and your psychology will adjust. The external performance shapes the internal experience. You begin to feel what you're performing. The ritual creates the emotion it's supposed to express. This is not cynical manipulation. It's sophisticated understanding of how humans work. We are not purely internal beings who then express our inner states outwardly. We are feedback loops. Our actions shape our feelings, which shape our actions, in continuous reciprocal influence. Confucianism, whether intentionally or not, had stumbled onto something profound. Ritual as a technology for shaping consciousness. But there was a darker side to ancestor veneration, one that trapped families in cycles of obligation and limited individual freedom in ways that could be genuinely oppressive. Every decision you made wasn't just about you. It was about the ancestors whose legacy you carried and the descendants who would inherit your example. Choosing a career, selecting a spouse, deciding where to live, all these had to be considered in light of what the ancestors would want and what would bring honor to the family name. This could provide stability and purpose. It could also be suffocating. If you wanted to pursue a path your family disapproved of, you weren't just defying your living relatives. You were defying the entire ancestral line, stretching back generations. The weight of the dead pressed down on the living, constraining choice, enforcing conformity, making rebellion not just socially difficult, but cosmically irresponsible. Women were particularly constrained by this system. A woman who married into a family became responsible for venerating her husband's ancestors, not her own. Her connection to her birth family's ancestral line was severed or severely diminished. Her value was partly measured by her ability to produce sons who would continue the husband's family line and maintain the ancestral rights. A woman who failed. To produce sons was a crisis not just for the present generation, but for the entire future of the family's relationship with its ancestors. Who would perform the rites? Who would maintain the tablets? The ancestors would be abandoned, left without sustenance, forgotten, a fate considered worse than death itself, since death was already accomplished and couldn't be made worse except through neglect. This created enormous pressure for male heirs, led to the practice of concubinage to ensure sons if the wife didn't produce them, and generally made women's worth contingent on reproductive success in particularly cruel ways. The system also created anxiety about death itself. Dying without descendants meant your own ancestral tablet would have no one to maintain it. You would become a hungry ghost, wandering without offerings, forgotten and pitiable. This was a horror that motivated everything from early marriage to desperate attempts to conceive late in life. And yet, despite these oppressive aspects, ancestor veneration also created genuine benefits that shouldn't be dismissed. It provided comfort in grief. The dead weren't gone. They were transformed, moved to a different status but still present, still connected. You could still speak to them, still include them in family life, still seek their guidance. The ritualizing of mourning gave structure to grief, provided clear actions to take when everything else felt chaotic and meaningless. It created intergenerational continuity. You weren't an isolated individual living for your own pleasure. You were part of a chain extending backward and forward through time. Your life had context, meaning derived from connection to something larger than yourself. It motivated virtue, knowing that you would someday be an ancestor, that your descendants would judge your life and character, that your actions would become part of family memory. This encouraged people to live with some thought to legacy, to reputation, to the long-term consequences of their choices. It enforced family solidarity. Regular rituals brought the extended family together, forced them to cooperate, maintained relationships that might otherwise have fragmented. The shared obligation to ancestors created a shared identity. These are not small things. In a world without modern social safety nets, without welfare states or extensive legal protections, the family was your security. Ancestor veneration was part of the glue that held families together, and families held society together. The philosophical question underlying all of this, the mystery that Confucius never quite answered, is, what exactly did the Chinese believe happened after death? The answer is frustratingly ambiguous. There wasn't a single unified conception of the afterlife in Chinese tradition. Various beliefs coexisted, sometimes within the same person's mind. Some believed in an underworld bureaucracy, essentially a spiritual version of the Chinese government, where the dead were judged, assigned positions, and lived in a realm that mirrored the living world. Others believed the soul divided into multiple parts. The Han, ethereal soul, that ascended to heaven, and the Po, corporeal soul, that remained with the body in the grave. The ancestor cult addressed primarily the Han, while grave offerings addressed the Po. Some believed ancestors eventually faded after several generations, their spiritual energy dissipating or merging with cosmic forces. This is why tablets were often retired after a certain number of generations. 4 or 5 was common, and the earlier ancestors were collectively honored rather than individually named. Others believed in reincarnation, influenced by Buddhism when it arrived in China. But this created a logical problem. If grandfather reincarnated as someone else, who exactly were you talking to at the ancestral altar? Various theological solutions were proposed, none entirely satisfying. The practical result was that most people probably didn't worry too much about the metaphysical details. They performed the rituals because that's what one did, because the rituals worked in social and psychological terms, regardless of their supernatural validity. Confucius would have approved of this pragmatism, even if he never explicitly endorsed it. The rituals evolved over time, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core elements. The introduction of Buddhism added new layers. The practice of burning paper offerings, for instance, seems to have been a Buddhist innovation that was enthusiastically adopted because it was more practical than leaving actual food to rot. The ancestors could use paper money, paper houses, paper servants in the afterlife. Just burn them, and the smoke carried them to the spirit realm. Convenient, and it created a whole industry of artisans making increasingly elaborate paper offerings. By the late imperial period, you could buy paper versions of essentially anything for your ancestors: clothing, furniture, even paper iPads and smartphones in the modern era, because apparently the afterlife has Wi-Fi and your ancestors need to stay connected. This might seem ridiculous, but it reflects something touchingly human: the desire to provide for those you've lost, to ensure their comfort even in death, to maintain the relationship through material expressions of care. Regional variations added further complexity. Southern Chinese might practice more elaborate rituals with greater Buddhist influence. Northern Chinese might maintain more austere classical forms. Minority groups within the Chinese Empire maintained their own ancestral traditions while adopting Confucian elements for official purposes. But everywhere, the basic pattern remained: regular offerings, ritual bowing, maintenance of tablets, observance of death anniversaries, family gatherings at graves, the weaving of the dead into the fabric of daily life. As you lie here, breathing slowly, perhaps you can imagine the scene: A family gathered before their ancestral altar on a festival morning. The smell of incense, thick and sweet, filling the room. Candles flickering. The tablets arranged in hierarchical order, each name carefully inscribed. The table laid with dishes, fish, meat, vegetables, rice, wine, prepared exactly according to tradition or family custom. The patriarch steps forward and bows deeply, holding the position. His breath is measured, his expression serious. He is speaking to his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, men he knew and men he knows only through stories. He is reporting the year's events, asking for guidance, expressing gratitude for their legacy. The rest of the family follows, his wife, his sons and their wives, the grandchildren, each bowing in turn, each maintaining the posture for the appropriate duration. The children, the youngest ones, don't fully understand what they're doing. They mimic their elders, trying not to giggle, occasionally needing to be shushed. But they are learning. They are absorbing the pattern, internalizing the practice. When they are old, they will stand where their grandfather stands now, performing these same rituals, training their own grandchildren. The ritual ends. The incense continues to burn. The family disperses to other activities, but the ancestors remain, silent witnesses watching over the household. Or not watching. Perhaps just represented by wooden tablets in a quiet room, the smoke of incense rising toward a ceiling, meaning nothing beyond what the living project onto it. The mystery of ancestor veneration is not whether it was true, but why it worked. Why did this practice sustain itself for thousands of years? Why did it feel necessary, real, important, to countless millions of people across centuries? Perhaps because it addressed genuine human needs, the need to belong to something larger than yourself, the need to give meaning to death, the need to maintain connections across the rupture of mortality, the need to structure grief and community and family identity. The ancestors may or may not have been listening, but the living were speaking and being heard by each other, and that may have been the point all along. The incense smoke rises, disperses, disappears. The family continues. The ritual endures. And in the quiet of the ancestral hall, in the flickering candlelight, in the careful arrangement of offerings that will soon be consumed or cleared away, there is something that feels, if not exactly sacred, then at least significant. A reaching across the boundary between presence and absence, an assertion that love, duty, and memory can outlast death itself, even if only in the minds and actions of those who remain, even if only for as long as someone still remembers to bow. We have suffered through a day of Confucian ritual, traced the life of the man who inflicted it upon civilization, and descended into the mysterious world where the dead remain uncomfortably present at family dinners. Now, finally, we arrive at the people who actually thrived in this system, the scholar officials, the educated elite who turned ritual mastery into political power and comfortable living. Because here's the secret they didn't advertise. If you could actually master all those impossible rules, if you could navigate the hierarchy without stumbling, if you could quote the classics while bowing at precisely the correct angle, life could be quite pleasant. Not easy, never easy, but pleasant, privileged, and wrapped in a cocoon of social respect that made all the memorization and posture monitoring almost worthwhile. Almost. The scholar official class, sometimes called the literati or shy, occupied a unique position in Chinese society. They were not hereditary nobility, though some came from noble families. They were not warriors, Though the ancient Shai had been a warrior class before, Confucius redirected their identity toward learning. They were not merchants, whom they philosophically despised despite often being economically dependent on them. They were not peasants, though they romanticized rural simplicity in their poetry while remaining firmly urban. They were, essentially, professional, educated people whose education qualified them for government service, and whose government service, or potential for it, gave them social status, political influence, and often considerable wealth. This was meritocracy with Chinese characteristics. You could, in theory, rise from relatively humble origins to the highest levels of government through education and examination success. In practice, you needed enough family wealth to support years of study, access to good teachers, connections to help you navigate the system, and extraordinary luck. But the theory was powerful. The idea that learning, not birth, determined status, that a poor boy who mastered the classics could become more respected than a rich man's son who hadn't. This was revolutionary. And sometimes, occasionally, it actually worked that way. Let us follow the life of a successful scholar official, a composite figure based on thousands of individual biographies from across Chinese history. We'll call him Zhang Wei because every third person in the historical records seems to be named some variant of Zhang something. Zhang Wei is born in the late Ming Dynasty, around 1580, in a moderately prosperous family in Jiangnan, the wealthy region south of the Yangtze River. His father is a minor merchant who has made enough money trading silk and ceramics to afford tutors for his sons. This is crucial. Without those tutors, Zhang Wei's story ends before it begins, and he becomes a merchant himself, or perhaps a clerk, or possibly just another forgotten person in the historical background. But his father, nouveau riche and ambitious, wants more for his sons. He wants the respectability that wealth alone cannot buy. He wants a scholar in the family. Zhang Wei begins his education at age 5 or 6. He learns to recognize characters, to write with a brush, to recite basic texts. The early years are memorization, the 3-character classic, the 100 family surnames, basic Confucian texts, reduced to digestible verses. He doesn't understand most of what he's reciting. That doesn't matter. Understanding comes later. First comes the imprinting of the texts onto the mind, the creation of a foundation upon which later learning will build. By age 8 or 10, he progresses to the 4 books, the Analects, the Mencius, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean. These are Confucian foundational texts, compiled and promoted by the Neo-Confucian scholar Zhu Xi in the 12th century, and made the basis of the imperial examination system. Zhang Wei will spend years studying these 4 relatively short books, memorizing every line, learning the approved commentaries, understanding the philosophical arguments, preparing to write essays analyzing their meanings. This is not casual reading. This is deep, obsessive engagement with texts that will determine his entire future. His daily routine is rigorous. He wakes early, before dawn in the winter months. He performs his morning ablutions, dresses carefully, even as a student presentation matters, and eats a simple breakfast. Then he studies, and studies, and studies. He sits at a desk, back straight, for hours. He reads aloud because vocalization aids memorization. He copies passages in his developing calligraphy, because writing reinforces learning, and because his handwriting must become beautiful. Examination answers are judged partly on calligraphic quality. He discusses difficult passages with his tutor or his fellow students, engaging in the kind of detailed textual analysis that would make a modern literary theorist feel right at home. What did Confucius mean when he said, "The noble person seeks within himself, the petty person seeks in others"? Is this about moral autonomy? Is it about self-reliance? What are the approved interpretations? How do they differ? Which commentary should we follow? This can go on for hours. It's intellectually demanding work, requiring concentration, memory, analytical skill, and the ability to navigate subtle philosophical distinctions that might seem trivial but could determine examination success or failure. Zhang Wei also studies the 5 classics: the Book of Changes, Divination and Cosmology; the Book of Documents, Ancient Historical Records; the Book of Odes, Poetry; the Book of Rites, Ritual; and the Spring and Autumn Annals, Historical Chronicle. These are longer, more difficult, and cover an enormous range of material from philosophy to history to poetry to ritual protocol. He must also master poetry composition, particularly regulated verse in the highly formalized styles preferred by the examination system. This means understanding prosody, tonal patterns, parallelism, allusion, and the ability to compose elegant poems under time pressure on assigned topics, and calligraphy, always calligraphy. His handwriting must be not just legible, but beautiful, displaying proper technique, aesthetic balance, and personal style within accepted boundaries. And the 8-legged essay, the bizarre examination format that required answers to be structured in exactly 8 specific sections, with rigidly defined rhetorical patterns. It was artificial, formulaic, and utterly essential to master. Zhang Wei studies like this for years, a decade, 2 decades, while his childhood friends become apprentice merchants or learn crafts or marry and start families. He remains in his study, reading, memorizing, practicing. His family supports him because they're investing in his success. If he passes the examinations, particularly the higher levels, the family's status will rise dramatically. They'll have an official in the family, or at least someone qualified for office. Doors will open. Marriages will become possible with better families. Business will improve because people want to maintain good relations with a family that has connections. But it's a gamble. Years of expensive education might produce nothing if Zhang Wei fails the examinations. And most people failed. The pass rates were brutal. Sometimes less than 5% at the provincial level, less than 1% at the highest metropolitan level. Zhang Wei takes his first examination, the county-level test, in his late teens. He travels to the county seat, enters the examination compound, and joins hundreds of other candidates in a grueling multi-day ordeal. The examination compound is like a temporary prison. Each candidate is assigned a tiny cell, literally called a cell, about 3 feet by 4 feet, with a board for sitting and writing. They bring their own food, bedding, ink, brushes, and paper. They are searched entering the compound to prevent smuggling in books or crib notes. Some people try anyway, writing tiny notes on clothing, in food, even tattooing information on their bodies. The penalties for being caught are severe. The examination lasts several days. Topics are announced, and candidates must produce essays, poetry, or other written responses. They work in their cells, in all weather. The exams are held in summer and autumn, meaning heat, rain, and sometimes storms. Candidates sleep in their cells, eat in their cells, relieve themselves in buckets in their cells. Some candidates have mental breakdowns from the pressure. Some become ill. Every few years, someone dies during the examinations, heart attack, stroke, suicide, and their body is removed quietly so as not to disturb the other candidates. Zhang Wei survives his first examination and passes. He becomes a Sheng Yuan, a licentiate, basically someone who has passed the first hurdle and is now an official scholar, entitled to certain privileges: exemption from corvée labor, a degree of legal protection, social respect. It's the first level of success, and many people never progress beyond it. They become local teachers, low-level clerks, or simply educated gentlemen living on family resources. But Zhang Wei is ambitious. He continues studying and takes the provincial examination a few years later. This is held in the provincial capital, and the competition is fiercer. Candidates who have already passed the county level, the best students from across the province. He fails the first time, and the second. This is normal. Many candidates take the provincial examination dozens of times over decades. Some die still trying. Zhang Wei passes on his third attempt at age 32. He is now a jurin, a provincial graduate. This is a significant achievement. Only a small percentage of candidates reach this level. He is now qualified for government office, though probably not a prestigious posting. More importantly, he can continue to the metropolitan examination. The metropolitan examination is held in Beijing, the capital, every 3 years. Candidates from across the empire converge on the capital for another grueling multi-day examination. The standards are even higher. The topics are more difficult. The competition is terrifying. These are the most successful scholars from every province, men who have devoted their entire lives to study. Zhang Wei travels to Beijing, a journey that takes weeks from the Jiangnan region. He arrives, finds lodging, and waits nervously for the examination date. He is 41 years old now. He has been studying for over 30 years. He takes the metropolitan examination and passes. He is now a jinshi, a metropolitan graduate, one of perhaps 300 men out of tens of thousands who achieve this in his examination year. This is elite status. He will certainly receive a government position. His family's investment has paid off spectacularly. There is one final examination, the palace examination, conducted in the Forbidden City itself, theoretically in the emperor's presence. This determines ranking among the jinshi. The top 3 receive special honors and immediate prestigious appointments. Zhang Wei places respectably in the middle, which is perfectly acceptable. He is now a member of the scholar official class, qualified for government service, socially respected, and about to discover what all that studying has actually earned him. His first posting is as a county magistrate in a rural region, a standard entry-level position for new jinshi. This is both an honor and a test. As county magistrate, he is the emperor's representative at the local level, responsible for tax collection, judicial decisions, maintaining order, overseeing public works, and generally being the government for tens of thousands of people. He has absolutely no training for any of this. His education consisted entirely of classical texts and essay writing. He has never studied law, administration, accounting, or practical governance. He is expected to figure it out, relying on his Confucian moral education to guide his decisions, and on his staff of clerks and assistants, most of whom are hereditary bureaucrats who actually know how things work, to handle the details. The irony of the examination system is that it tested nothing actually useful for government administration. It tested mastery of classical texts and literary skill on the theory that moral character and cultural refinement would naturally produce good governance. Sometimes this worked. Often it didn't. Zhang Wei arrives at his posting to discover a county with ongoing land disputes, tax arrears, bandit problems, a deteriorating irrigation system, and a local elite family that has been essentially running things for decades and does not appreciate interference from some newly arrived official. He must navigate this using ritual propriety, Confucian principles, and whatever practical intelligence he can muster. His daily life as a magistrate is actually quite comfortable, despite the challenges. He lives in the official compound, a walled complex with private quarters, offices, courtyards, and gardens. He has servants, cooks, clerks, and guards, all provided as part of the position. His salary is modest by elite standards, but supplemented by customary fees and gifts that everyone pretends are not bribes, but absolutely are. He holds court several days a week, hearing legal cases, arbitrating disputes, and making administrative decisions. He sits elevated above the petitioners, who must kneel when addressing him. He is dressed in official robes, appropriate to his rank with insignia indicating his position. He is the embodiment of imperial authority, and people bow to him the way he once bowed to his teachers. The cases are often tedious. Land boundary disputes between peasant families, accusations of theft, marriage contract disagreements. Occasionally, something more serious, assault, murder, major corruption. Zhang Wei must hear testimony, examine evidence, consult legal codes, and render judgment. His Confucian education actually provides some framework for this. The emphasis on fairness, on maintaining harmony, on considering context and character, rather than just rigid law application. These are useful principles. He tries to mediate disputes rather than simply imposing judgments, tries to restore harmony rather than just punishing wrongdoing. Sometimes this works beautifully. A case where both parties feel heard, a compromise solution is reached, and everyone leaves satisfied. Sometimes it fails spectacularly. A powerful local family manipulates the process. Witnesses lie, evidence is fabricated, and Zhang Wei realizes too late that he's been played by people far more experienced in local politics than he is. He learns. Over years, he becomes better at his job, more skilled at reading situations, more aware of the gap between Confucian ideals and practical realities. He is promoted, eventually, moving to a larger county, then to a prefecture, gradually climbing the administrative hierarchy. Each promotion brings more responsibility, more prestige, more income, and more danger. Because the higher you rise, the more you're entangled in factional politics, the more enemies you accumulate, the more vulnerable you are to accusations of corruption or incompetence or ideological deviance. But it also brings privileges. As a successful mid-level official, Zhang Wei's life is genuinely pleasant in many ways. He lives in beautiful compounds with gardens designed according to aesthetic principles laid out in classical texts. The gardens are not just decorative. They're expressions of philosophical ideas, the balance of rock and water representing yin and yang, the careful arrangement of plants suggesting natural harmony, the inclusion of literary references and pavilion names, and inscribed stones demonstrating cultural refinement. He spends evenings in these gardens, sometimes alone in contemplation, sometimes with fellow officials discussing poetry and philosophy, sometimes hosting elaborate dinner parties where the food, wine, music, and conversation are all carefully choreographed performances of elite culture. The dinners are their own form of ritual, different from family meals. Multiple courses, each presented with aesthetic care. Wine served in specially selected vessels. Entertainment provided by musicians or performers. Conversation that demonstrates wit, learning, and cultural sophistication without appearing to try too hard. The guests are other officials, local gentry, visiting scholars, men of comparable status with whom Zhang Wei must maintain complex social relationships that blend genuine friendship, professional networking, and factional positioning. A dinner party is never just a dinner party. It's an opportunity to build alliances, display refinement, exchange information, and subtly negotiate the endless political maneuvering that characterizes elite life. Zhang Wei also maintains his scholarship. Officials are expected to continue studying, writing poetry, producing calligraphy, perhaps even contributing to classical scholarship or historical works. This isn't merely personal interest, it's professional requirement. An official who stops engaging with literary culture loses respect and becomes vulnerable to criticism that he's become a mere administrator rather than a true scholar official. So Zhang Wei rises early, handles administrative duties, holds court, manages his staff, and then, in the evening, retires to his study to read poetry, practice calligraphy, or compose essays. It's exhausting, but it's also what being a scholar official means. You never stop being a scholar, even when you're entirely occupied with being an official. His family life is equally complex. He is married, of course, married young, to a woman selected by his family for appropriate status and connections. His wife manages the household, supervises servants, raises children, maintains relationships with female relatives, and generally handles the entire domestic sphere that makes his official life possible. They have a working relationship more than a romantic one, though affection may develop over decades. His wife is intelligent, capable, and essential to his success. But their relationship is governed by the same hierarchical principles as everything else in their lives. He is her husband, her superior in the family hierarchy. She is respectful, deferential, and manages to exercise considerable power through the very structures that seem to limit her. She decides household expenditures, manages servants, arranges marriages for children, maintains crucial social networks among elite women that parallel and often influence the male networks of power. She is hardly powerless, but her power operates through different channels, often invisible to the official records that focus on male activities. Zhang Wei likely has concubines as well. This is normal for wealthy officials, not scandalous. The concubines are lower status than the wife, occupying an ambiguous position between servants and family members. Their children are legitimate but ranked below the wife's children in inheritance and status. It's complicated, often emotionally fraught, and managed through the same ritual protocols that govern everything else. His children are raised with enormous advantages and enormous pressure. The sons will be educated, just as he was, with the expectation that they'll take the examinations and ideally match or exceed his success. The daughters will be educated, too. Unusual for most families, but elite families often educated daughters to make them more desirable marriage prospects for other elite families. The pressure on the sons is intense. They're growing up with privilege, yes, but also with the knowledge that if they fail to pass the examinations, they'll be disappointing not just their father, but the entire family, including the ancestors whose tablets watch from the family shrine. Some sons thrive under this pressure, others crack. Elite families have their share of dysfunctional children, sons who rebel, who fail repeatedly at the examinations, who turn to drinking or gambling or just give up and live as idle gentlemen on family wealth. The historical records occasionally mention these failures, usually with disapproval, sometimes with surprising sympathy. Zhang Wei's career eventually peaks. Perhaps he reaches the level of provincial governor, one of the highest positions below the central government. Perhaps he remains at a prefecture or department level, still prestigious, still powerful, just not at the very top. Most officials never reach the highest levels. The pyramid narrows sharply at the top. In his 60s, he retires. Officials were expected to retire at 70, though they could request retirement earlier, especially if parents were elderly and needed care. Filial piety could trump career ambition, at least officially. Retirement for a successful scholar official is comfortable. He returns to his home region if he's been serving elsewhere, or remains in his current location if he prefers. He lives on savings, investments, and probably income from land that he's accumulated during his career. He might do some teaching, mentoring younger scholars, serving as an informal advisor to current officials. He spends more time in his garden, which he has been embellishing for years and which is now a masterpiece of subtle design. He writes poetry reflecting on his career, on the passage of time, on the contrast between youthful ambition and elderly wisdom. He practices calligraphy, achieving a fluid mastery that comes only after decades of practice. He prepares for death with the same ritualized care he's applied to everything else in his life. He ensures his will is properly composed, his ancestral obligations arranged, his tomb prepared. Elite tombs could be elaborate. Underground chambers filled with grave goods, inscribed with biographies praising the deceased's virtues. Zhang Wei's tomb will be respectable, appropriate to his rank, a final statement of status that will last beyond his lifetime. When he dies, in his mid-70s, let's say, after a life of study, service, and careful navigation of countless social rituals, he is mourned by his family, honored by his colleagues, and eventually becomes one of those ancestral tablets that a new generation will bow to each morning. His life, viewed from outside, was a success. He rose from merchant family origins to the scholar official class. He served competently, accumulated wealth and respect, raised successful children, and died with honor. By the standards of his society, he lived well. But what did it actually feel like? This is harder to know. The historical records preserve his official career, his poetry, his administrative decisions. They don't preserve his private thoughts, his doubts, his moments of wondering whether all the studying and bowing and careful political maneuvering was worth it. Did he ever, in his garden at twilight, wonder what it would have been like to live a simpler life? To be a merchant like his father, free from the constant performance of scholarship and refinement, to not have to worry about whether his calligraphy was adequately expressive or whether his poetry displayed appropriate learning without seeming pretentious. Probably, almost certainly, because humans, no matter how successfully socialized into a system, still have moments of doubt, of weariness, of wondering about roads not taken. But he also probably felt genuine pride in his achievements, genuine satisfaction in mastering a difficult system, genuine pleasure in the aesthetic and intellectual dimensions of elite culture. The poetry wasn't just obligation, it could be genuinely moving. The gardens weren't just status symbols, they were beautiful, contemplative spaces. The relationships with other scholars weren't just networking, they could be real friendships based on shared values and experiences. The scholar-official life was privileged, yes, but it was also earned through grueling effort. It was comfortable, but never relaxed. It was respected, but also endlessly scrutinized. It offered purpose, status, and meaning, but demanded constant performance, eternal vigilance, and subordination of individual desires to social expectations. In other words, it was complicated, as is all of life, regardless of era or system. The specifics change, the rituals, the hierarchies, the particular forms of pressure and privilege, but the fundamental human experience of navigating between desire and duty, between individual will and social structure, between comfort and authenticity, remains constant. Zhang Wei, our composite scholar official, lived in a world utterly foreign to modern experience, a world where your morning routine was prescribed by texts written 1,000 years before your birth, where your career depended on memorizing those texts and writing about them in exactly the correct style, where your social position required constant performance of cultural refinement, where the dead remained present at every family meal. And yet, he was recognizably human. He studied because he wanted to succeed. He navigated politics because he wanted to advance. He wrote poetry because it gave him pleasure and status. He worried about his children. He grew old and reflected on his life with the same mixture of satisfaction and regret that humans have always felt. The forms were uniquely Chinese, uniquely Confucian, products of a specific historical and cultural context that no longer exists in quite the same way. But the underlying human concerns, the desire for meaning, for security, for respect, for connection, for leaving something behind, these are universal. The scholar officials have been gone for over a century now. The examination system was abolished in 1905. The imperial government collapsed in 1912. The communist revolution reshaped Chinese society in ways that would have been unimaginable to Zhang Wei and his peers. But the gardens remain, some of them, preserved as historical sites. The poetry remains, still read, still appreciated. The calligraphy remains in museums and private collections. The ancestral tablets are mostly gone, destroyed, or abandoned, but the practice of honoring ancestors continues in modified forms. And somewhere in China today, there are probably students staying up late, memorizing texts for examinations that will determine their futures, feeling the same pressure Zhang Wei felt centuries ago. The forms change, the rituals adapt, the specific hierarchies transform. But the fundamental human experience of trying to succeed in a demanding system, of balancing individual desires against social expectations, of seeking meaning and status and security through mastery of cultural forms, this continues. We are not so different from the scholar officials, really. We just have more comfortable chairs and don't have to bow as often. Though some days, looking at modern life, the performance of success on social media, the endless credentialing for employment, the careful management of personal brand, the anxiety about status and achievement, you might wonder if we've really escaped the examination system at all, or just renamed it and moved it online. But that's a thought for wakefulness. For now, let it drift away, like incense smoke rising toward an invisible ceiling. The scholar officials have had their moment in your thoughts. Let them return to history, to the silence of the past, to the gardens where they once sat composing poetry about the transience of all things. They would appreciate the irony. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the world of Confucian ritual, philosophy, and the peculiar beauty of a civilization that decided the proper angle of a bow was worth approximately 2,000 years of obsessive attention. We began with you, struggling to survive a single day in this system, failing at breakfast, exhausting yourself with constant bowing, discovering that even sleeping had a correct position. We followed Confucius himself, a man who spent 72 years trying to convince people that what they really needed was more rules about sitting and who somehow won that argument centuries after his death. We descended into the mystery of ancestor veneration, that strange practice of maintaining relationships with the dead through carefully arranged fruit and ritualized conversation. And we ended with the scholar officials, the educated elite who actually mastered this impossible system and transformed ritual competence into comfortable, privileged lives. What does it all mean? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it's just history, a record of how some people, in some places at some times, chose to organize their lives according to principles that now seem alien and exhausting. Or perhaps it means something deeper, something that persists beneath the specific forms. The Confucian system, for all its rigidity and formality, was attempting to answer fundamental human questions. How do we live together without descending into chaos? How do we create meaning in a world that often seems meaningless? How do we connect with something larger than ourselves, with family, with tradition, with the cosmos itself? How do we cultivate virtue, maintain relationships, and create beauty in the brief span between birth and death? Their answers involved a lot of bowing, a truly staggering amount of bowing. But beneath the bowing was a coherent vision of human flourishing based on cultivation, ritual, hierarchy, and connection. You might disagree with that vision. You might find it oppressive, restrictive, exhausting. You would not be wrong. It was all those things. It limited individual freedom, enforced conformity, trapped people in roles determined by birth and gender, and created cascading obligations that could be genuinely crushing. But it also provided structure, meaning, and community. It gave people clear guidance on how to behave, what to value, how to find purpose. It created beauty in gardens, in poetry, in calligraphy, in ritual performances that were aesthetic achievements as much as religious obligations. It maintained social cohesion across centuries of political upheaval. It produced one of the world's great civilizations. These things can be simultaneously true. The system was oppressive and it created beauty. It was restrictive and it provided meaning. It was exhausting and it sustained people through difficulty. History is complicated. Civilizations are complicated. Humans are complicated. The Confucian world is gone now, mostly. The imperial examination system is finished. The rigid hierarchies have been challenged, dismantled, reorganized. Women are no longer legally confined to their husbands' households. The scholar officials are replaced by different elites with different sources of authority. But some things persist. The emphasis on education as a path to success, the reverence for teachers, the importance of family, the practice of honoring ancestors, even if in modified forms, the aesthetic values that shaped those gardens and that poetry, the fundamental conviction that self-cultivation matters, that how you behave shapes who you become, that ritual and practice can transform consciousness. These ideas didn't die with the Qing dynasty. They adapted, evolved, mixed with new ideas, and continue to influence Chinese society and, through Chinese diaspora and cultural exchange, the broader world. You can see echoes of Confucian thought in modern East Asian educational culture. The long hours, the examination pressure, the emphasis on mastery through practice. You can see it in approaches to hierarchy and respect, in family structures, in attitudes toward aging and death. You can also see reactions against it, the rebellions, the rejections, the desire for individual freedom and spontaneity that Confucianism seemed to constrain. The Taoist tradition, which flourished alongside Confucianism, offered an alternative vision. Naturalness over artifice, spontaneity over ritual, withdrawal over engagement. The two traditions coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in unexpected harmony, each providing what the other lacked. But tonight, we have focused on Confucius and his legacy, on the ritual order that shaped daily life, on the ancestors who watched from their tablets, on the scholar officials who mastered the system and lived comfortable lives within its constraints. And what we've discovered, perhaps, is that you genuinely wouldn't last a day in that world. Not without training, not without socialization from birth, not without internalizing values and assumptions that are foreign to modern sensibilities. You would bow at the wrong angle. You would sit before your turn at breakfast. You would fail to properly venerate the ancestors. You would find the constant performance of hierarchy and ritual exhausting rather than comforting. You would want to just relax, slouch a little, eat without thinking about cosmic harmony, and generally live like a barbarian. And that's fine. That's more than fine. That's the privilege of living in a different time, with different values, different freedoms, different constraints. You don't have to maintain ancestral tablets. You don't have to spend decades memorizing classical texts. You don't have to bow to your older brother every morning. You can wear mismatched socks, skip family dinners with a text message, and eat lunch however you want. You have freedoms that Zhang Wei, our scholar official, could never have imagined. The freedom to choose your career without reference to family tradition. The freedom to marry or not marry, according to personal preference. The freedom to question authority without being accused of threatening the cosmic order. The freedom to just be yourself, whatever that means, without constantly performing a prescribed role. These are real freedoms, valuable freedoms, hard-won through historical transformations that dismantled hierarchies and challenged traditional authorities. But you've also lost some things. The certainty of knowing exactly what to do and why. The deep sense of connection to family and tradition that comes from regular ritual practice. The community cohesion that shared ritual creates. The aesthetic refinement that comes from devoting your life to arts like calligraphy and poetry. The comfort of being part of a chain, extending backward to ancestors and forward to descendants, giving your individual life cosmic significance. These are real losses, and it's worth acknowledging them even as we recognize the benefits of modernity. Perhaps the lesson, if there is one, is not that the Confucian system was right or wrong, good or bad, but that every social arrangement involves trade-offs. Every civilization makes choices about what to value and what to sacrifice. Every era has its freedoms and its constraints, its beauties and its horrors, its moments of transcendence, and its grinding daily difficulties. The past is foreign. We cannot return to it, and mostly we shouldn't want to. But we can visit it in imagination, can try to understand it on its own terms, can appreciate what it achieved even as we recognize what it cost. And having visited, having spent these hours wandering through the daily rituals and ancestral halls and examination cells and elite gardens of Confucian China, you can return to your own time with perhaps a slightly different perspective. Your life, with all its modern complexities and anxieties and freedoms and constraints, is just one way of being human among infinite possibilities. The struggles you face, finding meaning, maintaining relationships, achieving success, creating beauty, dealing with mortality, these are the same struggles humans have always faced, just in different forms. Zhang Wei worried about examinations and factional politics. You worry about job interviews and office dynamics. The specifics differ. The underlying experience is remarkably similar. Confucius tried to create a perfect society through ritual and education. You try to create a good life through whatever methods you've chosen, probably involving less bowing, but equally sincere effort. The ancestral tablets are gone, but you still grapple with how to honor those who came before you, how to maintain connections across generations, how to give death meaning, and create continuity beyond your own brief existence. Different forms, same human concerns. And now, as this journey ends, as the images of Confucian China begin to fade from your mind like incense smoke dispersing into air, you can let yourself settle more deeply into comfort. You are not in an examination cell, writing essays for 3 days straight. You are not bowing to ancestral tablets each morning before breakfast. You are not performing the 8-legged essay or memorizing the classics or maintaining perfect sitting posture for hours. You are here now, in your own time, in your own comfortable space, free to sleep in whatever position you prefer, on whichever side feels right, without worrying about the orientation of your heart toward heaven. The scholar officials have returned to their gardens. Confucius has returned to his study, forever teaching disciples who ask questions we can no longer quite hear. The ancestors have settled back into their tablets, or into memory, or into whatever eternal rest they occupy beyond the reach of ritual offerings. And you can rest as well. Let the details fade. The bowing, the hierarchy, the examination pressure, the ritual meals, the ancestral veneration. Let it all recede into historical distance. What remains is perhaps just a gentle appreciation for the complexity of human civilization, the strangeness of the past, and the peculiar fact that people managed to live full, meaningful lives in circumstances utterly different from your own. They woke each morning and found purpose in activities that would seem impossible to you. They found beauty in forms you might not recognize as beautiful. They created meaning through practices you might see as empty formality. And they were no less human for any of that. Just different. Wonderfully, exhaustingly, fascinatingly different. Sleep now, knowing that you have visited their world and returned safely to your own. Sleep knowing that you don't have to bow to anyone tomorrow morning unless you particularly want to. Sleep knowing that your breakfast can be as informal and chaotic as you prefer. Sleep knowing that the ancestors, if they exist at all, probably don't mind if you forget about them occasionally. Sleep knowing that the proper sitting position is whichever position lets you actually relax. The past has released you. History has told its stories and asked nothing in return but attention, which you have given. Now there is only the gentle darkness, the quiet of your room, the comfort of your bed, and the long, peaceful hours until morning. No rituals to perform, no hierarchies to navigate, no examinations to pass. Just rest. Deep, dreamless, unregulated rest. The kind Confucius himself might have envied, if he could ever have stopped thinking about the proper way to sleep long enough to actually do it. Good night.